Yeah. Okay. Okay. I will go.
Okay, so welcome everyone. My name is Kate Quinn, and I am co-convener of the Caribbean Seminar Series here at the UCL Institute of the Americas, along with my colleagues, Professor Gad Human and Dr. Steve Cushion. It's a real honor to introduce tonight's speaker, Professor Linden Lewis, who is Emeritus Professor of Sociology at Bucknell University and the editor of books including Caribbean Sovereignty, Development and Democracy in an Age of Globalization from 2013, co-editor of Color, Hair and Bone, Race in the 21st Century from 2008, editor of The Culture of Gender and Sexuality in the Caribbean from 2003, and has published very widely on areas including gender, race, labor, globalization, and culture. And just before we started the seminar, he was saying he's also shortly to have something coming out on George Lamming, which we very much look forward to. So tonight, I'm particularly thrilled to have someone speaking about the era of post-independence Guyana with this wonderful book that we're going to be hearing about on Forbes Burnham, The Life and Times of the Comrade Leader, which has just been published by Rutgers University Press in 2024. So we will give Professor Linden approximately half an hour to speak, and then there will be plenty of time at the end for your comments and questions. So just a reminder to everyone to stay on mute. And if you have a question, you can put it into the chat. Or
I don't know what's happened there.
Oh,
there we go. All right.
Yeah, you're still with us. Good.
Yeah.
So welcome, Professor Linden Lewis, and I'm going to hand over to you now.
Thank you. I just want to do a shout out to Jean Stubbs, whom I see there, and Jane Bassoon, whom I haven't seen in junkies years. I want to say one thing before I start, and I learned this from being in St. Martin. The word comrade in the title is simply the term that is often used to describe Burnham, and certainly during the time that he lived. It has nothing to do with a political statement about where the biography is going. So comrade is just a term that is used there. British Guyana, now Guyana, is located in the northern coast of South America. The country derives its name from the Arawak-Guyana language, which means land of many waters, and Georgetown is its capital. Forbes Burnham was Premier, Prime Minister, and first Executive President of the Cooperative Republic of Guyana. He held political office excuse me, from 1964 until 1985. By the time of his death, he had guided British Guyana to independence in 1966, leading to the rechristening of the country from Guyana, G-U-I-A-N-A, to Guyana, G-U-Y-A-N-A, and had presided over the Cooperative Republic from 1970 to 1985. The political trajectory of Forbes Burnham, his charisma, the domination of the party he led, the People's National Congress, and his nationalist and Pan-Africanist philosophy represent a unique perspective from which to understand Guyanese colonial and post-colonial history, a history which is marked by British colonial domination that presided over slavery and indenture. The imperial history was combined and amplified in conjunction with the United States Cold War interests in thwarting any communist design from emerging in the Americas. It is virtually impossible to understand the history of modern Guyana without understanding the role played by Forbes Burnham in shaping its development, beginning with his contribution to the colonial resistance to the consolidation of independence. For Burnham had been, Forbes Burnham had been a formidable Caribbean leader. He was in the forefront of significant regional and economic and political initiatives. Forbes Burnham was undoubtedly a charismatic individual. We use the term charisma to describe a person who is dynamic, engaging, and persuasive at one level or another. The sociologist Tom Bottomore noted that, quote, "The charismatic leader is the politician who can most effectively arouse nationalist fervor and set or keep the nation, on the path to glory," unquote. What is critically important to understand here is that a biography of Forbes Burnham is also a textbook example of what happens when charisma is not enough. Indeed, when charisma becomes routinized and gives way to practices of authoritarianism and oppression. It is a study of both the appeal and the disdain of the authoritarian leader. Forbes Burnham maintained himself in power through an elaborate system of vote rigging nationally and internationally via overseas proxy voting. The rationale behind this biography is therefore to attempt to understand the complexity of the political leader and the way that charisma and authoritarianism, as well as popular nationalism, intersect. The purpose is also an attempt to discern the ways in which a society creates the space in which such an authoritarian personality emerges, and how such dictatorial tendencies are combined with promoting a sense of national pride, leadership in the arts, and international and regionally progressive politics. The portrait is also an analysis of the nature of postcolonial leadership and its pitfalls. I want to talk just briefly about what I call a genealogy of being. This presentation has as its focus the genealogy of being. It is an attempt to understand the nature and essence of a man who emerged from humble beginnings to lead a poor South American and Caribbean country. In the process, he had to overcome an internalized logic of the dominant colonial education and socialization of his day to begin to imagine himself as the leader of an independent country in the family of nations. In short, the intent here is to examine some of the circumstances that shaped Forbes Burnham's sense of being by tracing the social and political philosophy of the man, through his history and practice. At various moments of the history, his leadership was visionary, controversial, and ultimately flawed. Through all of the colonial and post-colonial struggles, Burnham occupied an important space and role on the regional and international stage. Linden Forbes Burnham was born on February 20th, 1923 in Kitty, a working class area of Greater Georgetown, Guyana. Kitty is still one of the most densely populated districts today. It is there in this working class area that Forbes Burnham's awareness of the status of the people who lived around him was ignited. The philosophy of his being is formed in this context, in the awareness of the lived experience of the people around whom he coexisted. Based on some of Forbes Burnham's reflections about his upbringing, it is this thinking, this sense of his own subjectivity, and the consciousness of his social and historical condition that remained with him throughout his life. In 1942, he won the prestigious Guyana Scholarship. The Second World War, however, prevented his departure to England, but by 1947, he migrated to pursue a law degree at the University of London. In 1949, Burnham returned to Guyana, and after a brief alliance with the League of Colored People, joined the Political Affairs Committee. Oops. The joined the PAC was the forerunner to the People's Progressive Party. In effect, the Political Affairs Committee became a political vehicle beyond the labor movement of the 1930s, through which the colonial conditions of British Guyana were contested, which stirred the emergence of radical politics and heightened nationalist consciousness around issues of political rights. The PPP was established in 1950. It mounted the first nationalist challenge to colonial rule and won in 1953, the 1953 elections handily. Many observers have noted that the People's Progressive Party of 1950 was the greatest hope for the future of British Guyana. It was viewed as a multi-ethnic, unified political party which embraced the aspirations of the people of Guyana to be free of colonial bondage and to encompass a notion of self-determination. Though on the surface this may have appeared a valid observation, if one dug deeper, one would find that the new party was somewhat less than unified and had different interpretations of the nationalist project. The PPP embodied people of Indian and African descent, two groups which had long been subject to colonially manipulated dissension, calculated to frustrate attempts at solidarity. It also contained a faction of Marxists, particularly Cheddi Jagan and his wife, Janet, along with others such as Brindley Ben, Rory Westmus, Martin Carter, and Lionel Jeffrey. Simultaneously, the party also included moderately left and left of center persons such as Forbes Burnham, in addition to Muslims and Hindus. It was therefore an amalgam of disparate individuals attempting to assemble under one tent. Some saw the early PPP more as a coalition than a wholly unified party. However, by 1955, the PPP had split into two factions, led by Cheddi Jagan and Forbes Burnham. Burnham led by the two men respectively. In summary, however, the upshot of disagreement between the two political leaders arose after 1953. In this period, Burnham began to argue that as chairman of the party, he was also leader of the party. This interpretation was contrary to the constitution of the party. Burnham objected and then drew a line in the sand, arguing for leadership or nothing. He later established a more center-left branch of the PPP by 1956. I want to turn now to the context of the politics in Guyana, which I describe as the Cold War context. A full appreciation of what happened in the colonial period of British Guyana necessitates some reflection on the global and political context of the day. The year 1947 marked the beginning of the Cold War, an ideological struggle between Eastern and Western superpowers for global supremacy and for the hearts and minds of people. Though Guyana was not geographically part of the ideological divide, it nevertheless became ensnared in the rhetoric and schisms of this period. Contributing to the entanglement of Guyana in this ideological struggle was the declaration of the PPP leader, and I think I might have, there you go, Cheddi Jagan and his wife Janet, that they were Marxists. There were other members of the party who had also declared themselves Marxists or Marxist-Leninists and had expressed empathy and support for the Soviet Union's socialist development and leadership. Such a political alignment on the part of an emerging political party fighting against British imperial control and in the ambit of the American articulation of Manifest Destiny, as well as the United States, United Kingdom Atlantic Charter, was destined to attract the attention of both the Americans and the British. The position was especially noteworthy insofar as there was no such radical political, philosophical embrace by any other political leaders in the Caribbean whose territories had acquired internal self-government status. In addition, the Cold War tension of the period, Guyana's nationalist struggles were also emerging at the beginning of the Korean War, in the glare of the Joseph McCarthy's witch hunts, and the start of the Cuban Revolution of 1953, which culminated in 1959 with the oust of Fulgencio Batista by Fidel Castro. There you go. The British suspended the constitution and overthrew the government a mere 133 days after the PPP had assumed office. Burnham and Jagan split in 1955, each retaining the PPP name, so there was a Burnhamite and a Jaganite faction of the PPP. Elections were held in 1957, and Cheddi Jagan and the PPP won once again. In 1961, despite all efforts against a repeat of the PPP victory, Cheddi Jagan won the election. Once again, Cheddi Jagan had won a convincing majority, despite all the challenges and obstacles placed in his way. What eventually became a major issue was the problem of conducting the elections of the first past the post system. Forbes Burnham then entered into a coalition with Peter de Gar, whose picture I just passed, to unseat Cheddi Jagan's PPP. Burnham's centrist political position was at least a contingency strategy of forging the possibility of a coalition with the United Force led by Peter de Gar, a Guyanese of Portuguese descent and an astute businessman. Burnham knew that on his own, the PNC could not win an election, given the numerical strength of the Indian community and their solid support of Jagan. Peter de Gar was a virulent anti-communist. He saw Cheddi Jagan and the PPP as ruinous to the development of British Guyana and, of course, to his own capitalist interests. The problem here for Burnham was that in the context of a racially stratified country, he could not rely entirely on the vote of people of African descent. Much of the drive behind the opposition to Cheddi Jagan emanated from John F. Kennedy. Very early on, Kennedy clearly communicated to the Prime Minister Harold Macmillan of Britain that the United States could not tolerate another Fidel Castro in the Western Hemisphere, and therefore was opposed to Cheddi Jagan leading British Guyana into independence. Kennedy, along with other members of his cabinet, felt that once free of the yoke of colonial bondage, Cheddi Jagan would show his true communist colors. By the time we got to the overthrow of the democratically elected government of Guyana, the Anglo-American alliance had significant practice in this regard. In summary, then, all of the elections in Guyana from 1968 to 1985 were tainted by the practice of electoral manipulation, and in the process, Forbes Burnham, through a number of political maneuvers, consolidated his rule and solidified his party's control over the National Assembly. I want to make just a few quick remarks about the state. We should examine the broader context of the state when examining the political practice of Forbes Burnham. It is in this sense that one could begin to understand his consolidation of power. In other words, the capitalist state, or more specifically, the peripheral capitalist state in the Caribbean in general, is conducive to producing a particular type of authoritarian leadership and personality demonstrated by Forbes Burnham. This type of personality of the political leader varies from country to country. Put differently, most Caribbean leaders display some measure of authoritarianism, whether it occurs in the way they handle criticism inside their own political party or outside in the wider society. Authoritarianism is also evident in political leaders approaches to decision-making and to their expectations of loyalty and deference. In the case of the rule of Forbes Burnham, some of these authoritarian tendencies were perhaps more pronounced than was the case with other Caribbean leaders. The above framework is also useful in understanding how control over the various apparatuses and levers of the state by the political leader is conducive to the type of abuse that permits the manipulation of an electoral machinery to remain in power, whether it is in terms of gerrymandering of political districts, facilitating voter fraud, voter suppression, or orchestrating a non-transparent system of vote counting. Forbes Burnham and his party operatives understood the technologies of manipulation and obfuscation in the drama of politics in Guyana. Burnham, like other Caribbean leaders, understood how to manipulate the ideological apparatuses of the state to his advantage. This control over the apparatuses of the state in Guyana placed him in a different category of authoritarian leadership from most other Caribbean leaders. It is nevertheless precisely the constitutive authoritarian character of the state that permits these types of development in the cut and thrust of the arena of politics. In 1974, the Forbes Burnham administration entered a new political phase. In a special party congress to mark the 10th anniversary of the People's National Congress in government, the Prime Minister, Forbes Burnham, introduced and articulated his philosophy of the party paramountcy. This new political orientation was announced and subsequently referred to in the Sophia Declaration. I always joke about this because most other people will call it Sophia. Most Guyanese call it Sophia. The Guyanese online would be able to talk about that. The presumed goal of the new direction was to mobilize the nation in all its dimensions, not merely at election time. It was on this occasion that Burnham declared that the party should assume unapologetically its paramountcy over the government, quote, which is merely one of the executive arms, unquote. The PNC was no ordinary political organization. It became the vanguard. The political leader projects such an attribute while the electorate is complicit in its validation, often unmindful of how appeals to national sentiment could obfuscate authoritarian practices and policies. Indeed, given Forbes Burnham's stewardship of the country from British Guyana to the independent nation of Guyana and subsequently moving to a republic, it is understandable that many would view him as leaving a legacy of national pride among the demos. One should be mindful, however, of the extent to which these national sentiments intersected with the interests of the political leadership in Guyana. We should not be unmindful of where the nationalist philosophy blended seamlessly with the advocacy of the cooperative project, which in turn should not be divorced from the political philosophy of party paramountcy. In practice, rather than merely embracing a sense of pride of nationhood, nationalism could very well be the handmaiden of the statist policies. The erosion of the practice of democracy in Guyana under the aegis of nationalism and even regionalism facilitated authoritarian policies with an appropriate cover. Burnham presided over a significant increase in the military expenditure. The GDF, Guyana Defense Force, was added to the Guyana National Service in 1974. Apart from defense, the function of the latter body came to include political education, hinterland development, and agricultural and industrial production. Added to the development was the People's Militia. Burnham institutionalized and formalized direct executive control over the military. Indeed, his control of the military was on full display in 1973 when members of the Guyana Defense Force were put in charge of transporting the ballot boxes to Georgetown for counting, an act which was part of the repertoire of an autocrat who was not only bent on maintaining power, but of consolidating his rule. To implement further constitutional control, the Burnham administration eliminated the plebiscite and two-thirds majority in parliament, which were needed to make constitutional changes. The Burnham administration proposed a referendum that would obviate the plebiscite as well as the two-thirds majority vote. This was the infamous referendum to end all referenda. Given the established practice of vote rigging, it was no surprise that the referendum passed, taking party paramountcy to an even higher level. Once the plebiscite was eliminated, given the PNC's two-thirds majority in parliament, the government seized the opportunity to introduce a new constitution in 1980. In addition, Forbes Burnham moved quickly to eliminate the British Privy Council as the final court of appeal. The president also exercised control over the civil service in terms of appointing members of the Constitutional Commission, the Public and Teaching Services, the police, the Director of Public Prosecution, Auditor General, Solicitor General, parliamentary secretaries, etc. Finally, one of the more revealing acts of the exercise of power had to do with the provision of presidential immunities. In effect, Burnham, and I think this would resonate with some people, in effect, President Linden Forbes Burnham, in the provision of presidential immunities, had placed himself above the law and was therefore accountable to no one. This provision was at the very apex of the modalities of control and power exercised by the head of the state in Guyana. After independence in 1966, Forbes Burnham moved fairly quickly in refocusing the country away from any colonial vestiges to the status of republic. On the 23rd of February, 1970, Guyana became the first cooperative republic in the world and the first republic in the Commonwealth Caribbean. In addressing the People's National Congress on the 13th annual Declaration of Congress, Forbes Burnham also noted, quote, "In becoming a republic, we removed the psychological ties with the British monarch, which in many cases had inhibited the thinking and colored the attitudes of several Guyanese," unquote. Very closely associated with the idea of the cooperative republic was what became a People's National Party mantra, namely the stated policy to feed, clothe, and house the nation by 1976. This notion was introduced in the context of the Second Development Plan of 1973. Unfortunately, history has not been kind to the Burnham administration's ability to deliver on the promise to feed, clothe, and house the Guyanese population. These programs were all spectacular failures. In short, the cooperative and policy tool had in effect become an instrument of the state. Clive Thomas concluded, quote, "The cooperative sector of the cooperative republic has played quite a marginal role," unquote. FCH had a price tag of approximately 1,150 million Guyana dollars over the 5-year period ending in 1976. The goal was to build 65,000 housing units. Even the government essentially had to concede that it could not achieve this goal. Feeding the nation was an even greater disaster. Much of the resources needed for housing and clothing the nation depended on the expanded production of agricultural commodities locally, so that there would be greater volume of exports to ensure more foreign exchange earnings. a program of nationalization, for example. An important adjunct to the economic strategy of the cooperative was the process of nationalization of foreign assets. The Demerara Bauxite Company Limited, a subsidiary of the Canadian Bauxite Transnational Aluminum Company of Canada, ALCAN, was the first to be nationalized in 1971. Guyana Timbers was nationalized in 1972 and Reynolds in 1975. In addition, a number of industries were nationalized over the next 5 years, including Booker Brothers Company in 1976. While the Burnham administration was proceeding with a program of nationalization, not everyone, even some in his inner circle, seemed convinced of the wisdom of this economic strategy. However, given Burnham's unquestioned authority, no one from his inner circle voiced or any objection, at least not publicly. Some have argued that the nationalization project failed because, among other things, they did not place people in technical positions by virtue of their expertise, but on the basis of their loyalty to the party. The Latin American Bureau report noted that not a single foreign company complained about the terms on which its business was acquired. Perhaps the transnational companies did not protest because of the bargain they had struck with the government. I want to turn very briefly here to the death of Walter Rodney because I think it's interesting in terms of our discussion. By 1980, the political situation had reached boiling point. Economic crises continued to plague the political economy, and protests and demonstrations increased. The WPA was clearly beginning to mobilize support across various constituencies and had begun to be a thorn in the side of the Burnham administration. Walter Rodney's profile as a credible political figure had risen in stature. The government had to do something to disrupt the growing influence of this young multi-ethnic party, which had abandoned old-style racial mobilization and represented an alternative to both the PNC and the PPP. On June the 13th, 1980, Walter Rodney was killed as a result of an explosion from an electronic device contained in a brown paper bag, which exploded in his lap. Rodney was sitting in a parked Mazda Capella car driven by his brother Donald Rodney in the area between John Street and Hatfield in Georgetown. At the time, he was believed to be testing a walkie-talkie, which his brother had obtained on his behalf from a retired Army Sergeant, Gregory Smith. Smith was an electronics expert in the Guyana Defense Force. Rodney's sudden and violent death as one of the most popular members of the WPA, a regionally and internationally renowned scholar, sent shockwaves throughout the Caribbean and the wider Guyanese diaspora. It was quickly labeled an assassination, the condemnation, all of which was directed at President Forbes Burnham and the PNC as being responsible for Dr. Rodney's death, was understandable. To no one's surprise, Burnham denied all knowledge of the demise of Walter Rodney. He philosophized, quote, "Sad as I am at Rodney's inglorious end, I know that somewhere therein is bound to be a lesson for the misguided others," unquote. The comment was followed up subsequently by an ominous warning by Burnham himself when he said, "Comrades, we are now in the Roman amphitheater. The lion and the gladiator cannot both survive. One must die, and we know that the People's National Congress will live," unquote. The Walter Rodney Commission report concluded, quote, We have no hesitation in holding Gregory Smith as responsible for Dr. Walter Rodney's death on the 13th of June, 1980, and that in so doing, he was acting as an agent of the state, having been aided and abetted so to do by individuals holding positions of leadership in the state agencies and committed to carrying out the wishes of the PNC administration, unquote. So this brings us to the ambivalence, and I'm getting close to the end here, the ambivalence of the legacy of Forbes Burnham. To commence an assessment of Forbes Burnham's legacy would require an observer to ask herself or himself, how does history remember him? History, however, is always intertwined with memory, which in turn is subject to forgetting. Given the polarized nature of Guyanese political history, the question becomes, is it possible to examine Burnham's legacy in entirely value-neutral terms? The racial polarization that occupied such a prominent space in the history of the national movement in Guyana almost assures us that not only the history of Forbes Burnham would be fashioned in the crucible of racial memory, but would also be framed by acts of forgetting. There's a type of forgetting whose purpose is to purge whatever is unsavory, unflattering, or unseemly about the subject of the memory. Such purging represents an abuse of memory. Another type of forgetting is characterized by the sins of omission. Over time, the memory becomes so dwarfed by political animus that all contributions to the nation are erased in the fog of partisanship. In assessing the legacy of Forbes Burnham, we should be reminded that while the individual cannot on his own change the objective condition of history by design, an individual from time to time can exercise a powerful influence on the shape of the social formation. In short, whatever we conclude about the legacy of Burnham, Guyanese must ask themselves, to what extent did they contribute to this history? Who among the demos aided in the fomenting of racial antipathy? Who worked strenuously to undermine government initiatives, even if they were in the best interests of the nation? Who aided and abetted political corruption? Who facilitated electoral rigging? Who participated in gerrymandering? Who, rather than staying and struggling for justice and change, fled to different shores? Who's the source of vicious rumors? Who saw their primary function as that of snitching on political followers or opponents? Who aided in the covering up of crimes? The death of the Comrade Leader. Linden Forbes Burnham was not in robust health, even though he appeared indomitable. He was reportedly born with only one kidney. He had cirrhosis and was also diabetic. And as a first-rate political orator, he developed issues with his throat and vocal cords, which led to hoarseness from time to time. On Tuesday, August the 6th, 1985, President Forbes Burnham was admitted to the #1 operating theater in the Georgetown Hospital at around 7:15 a.m. for minor throat surgery, which was occasioned by his leukoplakia, a non-cancerous condition, which in some cases can become cancerous. By all accounts, the operation seemed to have gone smoothly. However, following the operation, his recovery seemed to be occurring slowly. This situation was exacerbated by difficulty he was experiencing breathing. Forbes Burnham then seemed to be in cardiac arrest and did not respond to treatment. He died around 10:45 a.m. on August 6, 1985. So ended the life of the longest living leader of the CARICOM area. President Forbes Burnham died when Forbes Burnham held office for 21 years. Like so many other politicians from the Caribbean, Forbes Burnham was not a perfect man. His imperfections, however, were magnified by the authoritarian nature of his leadership. The manner of which he secured his power and reproduced himself in office. Though from time to time, other Caribbean leaders have been accused of electoral manipulation or gerrymandering, Burnham's peccadillos were perhaps more egregious than most. The feature of his character accounts in large measure for the ambivalence of his legacy. Nevertheless, Burnham's personality was larger than life. He was respected among the Caribbean as a major political leader who was viewed in his party and beyond as a visionary and powerful leader. 39 years after his death, Burnham is remembered in Guyana and throughout the Caribbean as a formidable political leader and an ardent regionalist and supporter of the struggles of the global South. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. So a round of applause. Perhaps you can unshare your screen so we can see you in full. And while people are thinking about their questions, maybe I'll kick off. So thanks again for giving that, nuanced portrait of a very complex man and the context that produced him, as well as the ambivalent legacies that you described. You used an interesting phrase somewhere towards the.
I'm trying to get the.
I think. Let me see. How do you do it? Maybe I can do it. The share button that is at the bottom of the screen, which is a little green arrow.
Yeah, I hit that one, and
no. How do we undo share? I click.
No. Let's see.
What's the problem?
I'm trying to get rid of the share button here.
Oh, I see the screen. Well, I wouldn't worry about that. Just carry on.
All right, you keep answering. I'll try to.
So the question I wanted to ask, you mentioned you used an interesting phrase about the complicity of the electorate, and then you also towards the end of the talk you raised that series of very important questions about who facilitated the the stuffing of the ballot boxes, the gerrymandering, and so forth. And I wonder if you could say a bit more about explanations for the extent to which people tolerated the authoritarian turn, and the kind of inflection point where some of his quote unquote sort of natural constituency began to move away, when you have the civil disobedience and the protests of the late 70s. So does it just come down to a combination of patronage, ethnic politics, and genuine admiration and support as to.
Okay, this is bothering me. I don't know if somebody knows how to get this thing off here. Okay, but I think I might see it here.
So when you click the arrow that's next to share, it doesn't have an option of stop sharing?
No.
No.
Okay, let's see. There we go. All right, I got it. All right. It took a little while. As I was saying to Kate earlier, when I use slides, I usually have a clicker that I can get there. All right. So you wanted to know
more about
the complicity? I think part of it is the populism that is involved here, and there is a sense in which he was a popular leader, and as a popular leader, I think a lot of people bought into Well, look, there's a combination of things. There's a racial category, there's a racial component to it. I'm still not getting this there. Anyway, there's a racial component to this, in which, given the polarized nature of the two leaders, whether they saw themselves as leaders only of their political ethnic group or not, that's how they were perceived. And so there are people who supported Burnham because he was Black. There were Afro-Guyanese, African Guyanese who supported Burnham because he was Black. In the same way that there are Indo-Guyanese who supported Cheddi Jagan because he was Indian, right? That's one part of it. But I think you also have to recognize the populism of Bob Burnham, his ability to persuade people to his own, all that is of interest to him, and I think that, you know, as with all charismatic people, there's the charisma, and then there's a leader, and then there are the followers. And the followers follow much like some of the followers that we see in the United States, who follow a person irrespective of what they've done. And I think that there's that is going to, but what, I don't know how far this takes me away from your question, but what is particularly interesting to me is the followership of this political leader even today, right? There are people who refuse to talk to me today, even though this man has been dead since 1985, because they fear some kind of retribution from his followers, and they don't want to say anything that is negative about him. And that is one of the things that I think that accounts for there's a sort of complicity. And I'm not saying that everybody was complicit with what he has done, but what I'm saying is that that there was a certain amount of belief in what he was doing and who he represented, and that's what they wanted to continue with.
Thank you.
I don't know if that answered all of your question. I'm still talking to you and trying to get.
We can see you perfectly well, so I don't know.
Okay, good. I want you to see me. That's okay. Yeah.
No, well, I suppose just to follow on from what you've just said, given that polarized legacy, and that people still wouldn't talk to you today, when you were doing the research for your book, did you have any hesitation at any moment about embarking on this project in the first place?
No, I grew up with this thing hovering over me. As I say in the book, I was named after him. But that's where the comparison ends. You know, he was a brilliant guy. I'm not in that mood. So I knew about him. My parents talked about him. You know, I was born in Guyana. I grew up in Barbados. And so while I was in Guyana, I attended the political meetings. Of course, I was too young and too small to really appreciate everything that was going on there. But when we moved to Guyana, when we moved to Barbados as a Guyanese family, and so everything Guyanese was still going on there, still relevant. My father, however, after a while distanced himself from his admiration for Burnham. But I think that you know, I'm sure some of the Guyanese online would tell you he was a very charismatic and very persuasive person, and could change the atmosphere in the room very easily. What were you going to say, Gad?
Well, I don't know, Kate, do you want to have the person?
Yes, You go ahead with your question, then we'll take the one from
Okay.
the chat.
Linden, that was really interesting, and there's a lot of things to think about. I've always been struck, and you mentioned it, of course, the assassination of Walter Rodney, the tragic assassination of Walter Rodney. And I understand why, what the motivation was, but given the fact that Rodney was such a brilliant historian, such a respected figure, all over the Caribbean, let alone elsewhere, did you ever get a sense of what Burnham's views personally about Rodney were, apart from the political problems that Rodney might have caused? Because I mean, everybody at the time, and I remember it so well, this felt like such a loss and such a tragedy. People still talk about it, of course, but whether Burnham ever expressed, or you got a sense, have a sense of a kind of personal view in realizing what he's done here.
If Burnham knew what he's done?
Yeah. I mean, on a personal, realizing this kind of figure that he is eliminated.
I think so, primarily because this is one of the biggest blots on his legacy. And I think a lot of people point towards him as eliminating a problem for him. And I should say, that Rodney represented a problem for both Burnham and Chetty. It's, I saw a review of my book by a friend who said that the book is almost a love letter to the WPA. I don't know where he got that from. But the point of the matter is, I think he wanted me to say that Chetty was somehow more enamored by Walter than was Burnham. Chetty did not embrace Walter. In fact, what Walter was doing was mobilizing across ethnic lines. This was counter to what had happened, the history of political mobilization in Guyana, right? So you're asking if Burnham, I can't tell you how he felt personally about Walter Rodney. I could only say that some people have indicated to me that he saw him as a problem. But I can't tell you about that. But as to the impact of his death on Burnham, he had to see it. I mean, everybody talked about it. Everybody talked about Walter, and in the next breath talked about Burnham. And as I said, I think that it has left a particular mark on the legacy of this man.
I agree.
There are other things that we could talk about him, but I think that was a big one.
I agree. Thanks. Yes, I agree.
So I'll move to the question in the chat, which is from Renuka, who would like to know more about Burnham's impact on race relations in Guyana, and says many speak to his legacy of creating and upholding ethnic fractures, specifically Indo-Guyanese and Afro-Guyanese race relations. Can you speak to this and how we contend with that legacy today?
Well, as I hinted in the presentation, that friction was not born of Chetty or Burnham. That is something that was cultivated in the colonial context, right? In the colonial history of Guyana. And as I've said a little earlier, whether those two men wanted to view themselves as an ethnic leader or not, that's how they were viewed because of the polarization. I would say, a friend and I had this discussion about Burnham, and I would say that neither of those men was really racist, right? Although I think a lot of people would say something to the contrary. And one of his biggest critics, an Indo-Guyanese sort of colleague of mine, said to me that he did not think that there was anything about Burnham that was particularly racist. And I would say that I've heard all kinds of things about Chaddy Jagan, but I'd also say that I don't think that he was a racist either. I think that when you think in terms of the racial polarization, it's just one of those things that is there. That was, I think, the central threat of Walter Rodney, that he was moving away from that kind of polarization. And that was an essential threat of both main political parties. Now, what we seem to be descending into again is that polarization. And so it's very much an Indo-Guyanese versus an Afro-Guyanese kind of thing that continues, right? But that would be my response to that particular question.
There's a question from Nicholas, and then we'll take Jean Stubbs after that.
Thank you, Kate, and for the talk and the book. So I was just typing my question in the chat, but it's more of a speculative question, but am I right in assuming that Burnham and Ramphal would have been of different political persuasions within Guyana? I was wondering if you could comment on the role of Guyana in the Commonwealth from, say, 75 to 85, when two prominent Guyanese leaders were presumably, well, obviously Ramphal was Secretary General, but I presume Burnham was also playing a role.
Yeah, they were actually pretty close. They were pretty close. And you know, he has passed recently. This is Ramphal.
Yeah.
They were pretty close. What I think is interesting is that I interviewed Ramphal in Washington, D.C. And to my surprise, he was very much opposed to nationalization. And so, actually, to quote him, he described those efforts, like feeding, clothing, and housing the nation, as gimmicks. Mm-hmm. So I was surprised that a person who was that close to Burnham felt that way in the final analysis, right? Mm-hmm. So I think they were good friends. I mean, he became his Attorney General, right? And one of the things that Ramphal said to me was, I asked him about the 1980 Constitution, the 1980 Constitution, the Guyana Constitution, and he immediately became very defensive. And I said, and he said, "What are you trying to ask me about that? I had nothing to do with it." And I said, "I didn't ask you if you had anything to do with it. You were repeatedly saying that you're a constitutional lawyer, and I was asking you to assess the 1980 Constitution. That's all I was asking." And then he said, oh, okay, right? But it says a lot, because as Kate was asking about Miles Fitzpatrick and David de Caries, who knew Ramphal very well, both of them said to me, there is no way that you can have a 1980 Constitution, that you could fiddle with the Constitution of Guyana without the knowledge of the Attorney General. If not, he's not worth being an Attorney General, right? So there's a complicated and complex relationship, I think, that existed between the two of them.
Thank you.
Thanks. That's actually a question that I had long wondered as to how Ramphal had squared his conscience, really, with being the Attorney General under Burnham. And I don't know how long he served in that position, but I mean, he must have seen some of the stuff that was going on, and perhaps also, don't know if
well, I think that what I think that what those two lawyers, by the way, were saying is not just that he had seen it, but that he had participated in it. And there's a section in the book where according to the information from the archives, there's a UN representative, a US representative, who is saying to Ramphal to be careful, to warn Forbes about how he's going to basically rig the election. He said, because we don't want this to mess up everything for everybody, right? And the fact that he's saying this to Ramphal is very instructive to me.
There's a question from Jean.
Hi, Linden. Good to see you again.
Hey.
Yeah, I have a couple of questions, really. One biggie, because for many of the years, I was observing Guyana through the lens of Cuba. And I wondered to what extent, I mean, we talked about this a little bit in St. Lucia earlier this year, but to what extent you account for the kind of the politics and the shifts because of the complexity of the relationship with Cuba and the complexity of the relationship of Cuba with the US, and by the same token, the US with Guyana. And it was always slightly enigmatic in Cuba, the whole thing between Jagan and Burnham, although clearly the racial component was understood. And the other question is really then much more personal. The two key women in his life were very strong political characters. His two wives.
Oh, okay.
Were very strong political characters in their own right. And there were some suggestions from the US end that he was influenced by them, etc. You didn't talk about them, but I wonder what your reflections on that might be.
Okay. Let me start with the Cuban one. In terms of Cuba, the initial connection between Guyana and Cuba was really made through Chedi. But that was superseded, I think, later on by the relationship between Burnham and Chedi and Castro, right? And then the struggle in Africa solidified the relationship between Burnham and Castro, because Burnham facilitated the refueling of the, I don't know how much you remember about that, but the refueling was done initially at the then civil airport, which is now Grantley Adams Airport.
I remember.
with Barrow, right? And then the State Department told Barrow that he can't refuel in Barbados, and so Forbes Burnham said, "Hey, I'll do it." And so I think that Cuba and especially Fidel Castro never forgot that act of comradeship. And so there was a strong bond. In fact, there's, maybe you remember, Jean, Harold Drayton? No? Certainly God knows him, but Harold Drayton is,
I do.
Harold Drayton was very much involved in a lot of those things. And he told me that there was some sort of a confusion at one point because both Burnham and Chedi got the Jose Marti Award, which is the highest form for a civilian, and that caused some consternation between the two of them. So I think that it was the relationship that was established as a result of the refueling of the planes to go to Angola. Plus, one of the things that, and I didn't have enough information on it, but that Burnham also sent troops to Angola, right? He had troops on the ground, and at tremendous cost to himself, because I mean the Americans were also leaning on him about the connection with the refueling and so on, and he eventually had to stop some of that refueling. But he also had troops on the ground. I don't know how many, but I do know that there were troops on the ground in Angola, right? So that's the first part. The second thing is, I beg to differ a little bit about the wives of the two wives, right? The first wife I interviewed in Trinidad, I never got the impression that she was a very political person, right? She didn't have that keen an interest in politics, and in the end, she said, you know, Burnham, politics was whom he was married to, right? And she said, you know, there was no time for family dinners and all this sort of thing, and that his main thing, the main thing in his life was his politics. And she got fed up of it, picked up her children and went to Trinidad, right? Mm. The second wife, I think, was more of a political colleague, more of a comrade. So she was more in line, I think, with the point that you're making about the political wives. I think she was more political. She was very much involved in the women's arm of this, and I discuss her in some in parts of the book. One, because she didn't want to talk to me initially, and then she eventually did, and she was very gracious. I really liked talking to her, and then she said to me before we ended the interview, she said, there's some things, she said, people talk about my husband all the time, but there's some things I know about him, but I am not giving the information to you. I'm writing this myself. And well, I can't argue with that. So I said, okay, you know, if that's how you feel. And so she never gave that information, some of which I found for myself, but she never wrote that. But yeah, I would say the second wife, Viola, was definitely a political person, and a person that I think he saw as a not just a colleague, but a comrade. Right? Were you suggesting that they exercise influence on him?
No, I'm always exercised by the fact that you get many more biographies of the men than the women. Very often there's a very strong woman. And of course she did go on and right up until her death had an important political position in Guyana. So I just wondered, since you hadn't mentioned it, that was all.
I mentioned her in the book. I mentioned her in the book, but I didn't mention her here because I just think that it would take me a lot further away. I struggled to keep within the half an hour. I don't know if I did. But even in the book, it took me. I think it would take me a while. I get the sense too that talking about the second wife would also have taken a good chunk of the thing. You know, it's somebody was saying to me that Percy Hinson, our friend Percy, Percy in a review of the book said that he thought that I could have made more of a connection to the Black nationalist movement and Burnham. I could have, but I wanted to focus on him, and there are a lot of side issues that I think you could go off on and end up writing what Clem wrote about Chetty, you know, like a 700-page book. And I think that Pat is trying to imitate him with her 500 pages. I don't know. I don't know. Does that answer your question, Jane?
Yeah. But my main question was really about the Cuba side, because as I'm listening to you about, you know, obviously the concern about the turn to authoritarianism, you know, though the conditions in which the closer you were to Cuba, the more difficult it was as a leader in the Caribbean.
Yes.
because you were, the US was gunning for you. It was far more difficult. And it was in that sense, really, that I was reflecting on, how then as a leader, one thing pushes you towards something else that may not have been your optimal leaning, if you want, because you make quite a lot of the authoritarianism.
Right, but you can resist. You can resist this sort of imperialism and so on without being authoritarian. It is quite possible to do this, and I think that it's really a question of his own personality and what he wanted to do, and how he viewed it. There's a part of the book that I talk about where he says, look, you have to, the comrades in the party have to recognize whether they want to be politicians and leaders in the party or whether they want to be family men, right? Whether they want to stay home and not come to the bar. He's very explicit about that, and I think that it is important to recognize that his what was central to him wasn't necessarily central to other people in the same way. But yeah, I think I understand what you're saying about the heavy influence of the West and on an individual, but it doesn't necessarily mean that that political leader has to go into an authoritarian mode. But I'm saying that if it's sort of counter to what Clive Thomas talks about in The Rise of the Authoritarian State. I like that book. The only thing about it is that I say the authoritarian state doesn't arise. The state itself is authoritarian. It doesn't have to reach a point that you say, okay, now it is authoritarian because you're manipulating the electoral process or something. By its very nature, it is authoritarian. Okay, I've gone on too long with you, Jean.
I'm wondering if I'm allowed to follow on just on the Cuba and the Cold War sort of theme. Yeah. I mean, another one of Burnham's contradictions, I think, is, do you think he played both sides in a sense that he, probably if his opposition hadn't been further to the left of him, then the US would have got rid of him before he went himself, as we see from other examples in the Caribbean. And, he benefited from that destabilization in the early 60s, but CIA and other destabilization that benefited his party at the expense of Jagan. And, I think he played both sides of the coin, that he did have support from the US probably right up to the end, would you say, as well as being able to project himself as this great progressive leader in non-aligned and other circles.
Yeah, that's the contradiction of the man, though. He did play both sides because he knew there's a section of the book where Shelley recognizes that there is a problem, that he's getting this pressure from the US. And he goes to Burnham and he says, look, we're not that far apart. Can we sort of work out something? And Burnham keeps saying, well, I always thought that we were far apart. And so, but if you want to talk about something, but while he was doing that, he was getting the assurance from the US that they would support him. So he absolutely played both sides for his own benefit. Yeah. I would argue that. I think that there's enough evidence to suggest that there is, that he did it.
Gad, you looked like you had a question, or?
Oh, I think no. I'm very intrigued by all this. Oh, I think that's fine. I think we've worked Linden pretty hard, I would say, and I think that's great.
Indeed,
you'll get the check. Sure.
Oh,
sure.
Good.
No, it's a fascinating discussion, and it's been a delight to have you here and to hear about this excellent book, which I think everyone should rush out and buy with this wonderful cover as well. So before formally thanking Professor Lewis for this excellent presentation, Let me just signal that our next seminar in the series, we will return in January, so keep your eye on the website. That will be Randy Brown speaking on his latest book. So
January 29th, by the way.
thank you, January 29th, we'll reconvene in the new year. So thank you again, Professor Lewis, that was great. And thanks everyone for your questions and discussion points. So in this awful virtual
Thanks for
world.
inviting me. Thanks for
Very
inviting me.
good. Very good.
Okay.
Yeah.
Our pleasure, our pleasure.
Okay.
That was very good, Linden. That was
Thank you, guys. Good
that
to
was-
see you and to see Jean.
yeah. No, that was
Although I've seen Jean